The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 18th chapter. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Be seated. I hope I'm not confusing you standing over here. Our PA is not entirely, and some of this applies directly to choir members, so I wanted to be looking right at you. Our PA system's not entirely installed, and so the pulpit mic, we're waiting for something on there, so that doesn't work. So I was preaching using this Dealey Barber mic, and then the S's were so hot I just sounded like a serpent up here preaching. So we'll try this one, and it'll all be finished and set in the next week or two. The story in our Genesis Bible reading for today is a great story, but like most stories, it's an even better story when you kind of tuck it into where it fits in the big picture story that it's part of. The big picture story I'm actually talking about here is pretty much the story of the entire Bible, by the way, but Genesis is important in that story in the way that it sets the table for the whole thing. That word Genesis means beginnings, and Genesis begins by saying, not in science language, but in a deeper kind of language, that whatever the science that was involved, and surely God was a great scientist, but whatever the science that was involved, behind it all was not coincidence. Whatever the science was involved, behind it all was a creator God. And that people were created to live life the way that his life is meant to be lived, by living their lives in a loving and trusting and obedient relationship to God. People talk about wanting to discover their purpose in life, which, my goodness, isn't that a good thing? But in the Bible, the really kind of biggest picture answer to what is your purpose in life is that it's not rocket science. Don't make it so very complicated. Your purpose is to be a rocket scientist, or a plumber, or a pastor, or a sophomore, or a third grader, or you, trusting God, obeying God, loving God, and living God's love for others. After, though, telling us that the purpose of life is to live life trusting and loving and obeying the desires of God, Genesis goes on to say that people, all people, kind of represented by two historical or prototypical kind of people, Adam and Eve, people thought we had a better idea. Genesis says that people decided that rather than living God's desires, we would much rather do what they darn well feel like doing in obedience to pretty much not much but our own desires. People, according to Genesis, would rather be God than have a God. Or to make that point, paraphrasing the language of Genesis 3, hey, pass the apples. The Bible has a spiritual word for that spiritual malady of wanting to be our own gods and follow our own desires rather than loving and trusting God and living according to God's desires. The word is sin. And sin, in the Bible's way of thinking, is the big picture answer to the big picture question, what in the world went wrong with this world that was created by God good? Next big picture Bible question: what in the world is God going to do with a world that keeps on proving it doesn't much want to have anything to do with him? That's the question that leads us to a key chapter in the book of Genesis, Genesis 12, where a man by the name of Abraham is reached out to by God. God who says to Abraham that he's going to bless him and he's going to bless his descendants with many blessings so that through them God can reach out to have back this world, which has said it doesn't want to have him. I'm going to bless you and your descendants, God says to Abraham. In other words, because I'm not going to take sin for a final answer. I still love my world. And I'm going to reach with my saving love to my world by reaching Abraham with saving love to and through you and your descendants. The entire rest of the Old Testament is basically the family story of Abraham's descendants and God. The entire rest of the book of Genesis is pretty much the family story of God and the next 3 generations of Abraham's descendants, starting with Abraham and Sarah's son, whose name is Isaac, and then moving on to Isaac and his wife's Rebekah's not at all identical twins, whose names are Esau and Jacob. And it is part of Jacob's story that we heard today as Anita read from Genesis 32. Jacob. It says in Genesis 25 that his twin but not at all identical brother Esau was actually born first, but that Jacob was hanging on to his heel as he was born, that even from the beginning, Jacob was trying apparently to pull ahead and be first. And that, it turns out, to know that story is pretty much to know the theme song of at least the whole first half of Jacob's life. I want to be first. Genesis 25 tells the story of Jacob taking advantage of his brother Esau's hunger and maybe his brother Esau's slightly dimmer bulb and tricking him out of his birthright, his larger inheritance that in those days belonged to the firstborn son. Then later in Genesis 27, and in cahoots with his mom, Jacob was mommy's boy. He took advantage of his dad's old age and blindness and deceived him into giving him the blessing which was rightfully to have belonged also to Esau as the firstborn. Bottom line, Jacob would have been a pretty interesting Bible character to meet, but you would not want to have him looking over your shoulder as you entered your PIN for your debit card at Fairway. Esau, as I told you, got burned more than once by his conniving little brother. Till finally, after the last time, Esau, who maybe wasn't terribly bright, but he was big, said, "I'm going to kill him." And he meant it. And Jacob heard it from his mom, and he ran, ostensibly back to the old country to find someone to marry, but in reality he was running to save his own skin. He was running to get out of Dodge to avoid what he absolutely had coming to him. Genesis 28 says that he ran as far as he could that first day, and then he stopped for the night. And he'd gotten out of town fast. He had not had time to pack much, and so he pulled up a rock for a pillow, and he tried to sleep, and he was alone, and he was scared. And when eventually he fell asleep, he had a dream, which you might remember from a Sunday school lesson or even Sunday school songs, even if some of them had terrible theology. In that dream, God comes down to him from the top of a ladder. The terrible theology song was, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder." God's the one who did the climbing. It's not us going to find God. It's God coming to find us. God came down that ladder and stood right beside Jacob, and he said, "You lying, conniving cheater, I'm going to give you what you've got coming." No, actually, that's what we would have said. What God said to Jacob, who was a lying, conniving cheater, is this: "Jacob, I am with you, and I am keeping watch over you. And I am going to do for you exactly what I promised your grandpa Abraham. I'm going to bless you richly. And through you and your countless descendants, I'm going to reach to bless and to save my world." It's a crystal clear moment of what some people mistakenly think is only found in the New Testament, except they are mistaken, because here it is right here. It's a moment of grace, which in the Bible is a word referring to God who comes to give us his blessing and his love and his gifts as a gift, a free gift, even to those who precisely don't deserve it. That's what grace is. Jacob woke up in the morning and continued his journey to the old country, which is now somewhere in eastern Turkey. And while he was there, his mom, whom he did dearly love, died, and he never saw her again. And in that development comes the reminder that even grace, though it loves and blesses undeserving sinners, doesn't, maybe can't, but certainly doesn't change the fact that sin, when we follow its desires, does often have consequences in our lives, and they are often painful. During his next 14 years in the old country, Jacob, in a kind of karma bites development, met another conniving schemer, his uncle Laban, who told Jacob he could marry his daughter Rachel, whom Jacob loved. And then Laban tricked the trickster into taking his other daughter, his daughter Leah, whom Jacob didn't love, as his first wife. By the way, if it's not clear yet, let me tell you something the book of Genesis makes clear. God, who does have plans and purposes and love for this world, again and again reaches to fulfill those plans and purposes and love by reaching to and through very real people, not perfect people. Weren't many other options. After 14 years, Jacob, who by the way now has 12 children, 7 by Leah, 2 with Leah's maidservant Bilhah, 2 with Rachel's maidservant Zilpah, and finally and at long last, 1 child at this point with his favorite, with Rachel. Her son was named Joseph. He immediately went on to become his dad's favorite son. Remember? Real world, real people, this is going to have consequences too. But after Joseph was born, Jacob, maybe because now he had this real son, I don't know, it doesn't say, but after Joseph was born, he decided it was time to go home to see his father, which of course also meant facing his brother. It is on that journey home that this story we heard earlier takes place. Jacob in our text is almost home, and he gets word that Esau is coming to meet him, and he has 400 men with him. And they're going to get here tomorrow. Jacob is scared, understandably. And that night, while his family sleeps, he wades back across this small little stream. It's called the Jabbok. It's a tributary of the Jordan over there in what is now Jordan. And once again, he's over there, and it's night. And he's afraid. And he's a day away from home. And he's a day away from his brother. And he's alone. Except, of course, once again, he's not. a man, says Genesis 32:22, a man came, and he and Jacob wrestled all night. And when it was almost dawn and neither of them had yet won the wrestling match, the other man, it says struck, but I mean it's almost an image of just put his hands there. It would certainly take more than even a strike. What the man did was dislodge his hip socket. This would be painful. And he says to Jacob, "Let me go, it's almost dawn." And Jacob, remember Jacob from the very beginning, clinging tightly onto Esau's heel, trying to get the blessing. Jacob now clings tightly to this man, and he says, "I won't let go until you bless me." And the man says, "What's your name?" And the man says, and Jacob says, "Jacob." And the man says, "You shall no longer be called Jacob," which means the one trying to crawl up and become what somebody else was meant to be. You should be at the top. You should no longer be called Jacob, but you should be called Israel, which means one who prevails with God, one who, wrestles with God. For you have done that, and you've prevailed. And Jacob says, "What's your name?" The man says, Note, he hadn't prevailed because he was that great a wrestler. It was a little bit fixed. He prevailed because this man who totally could have taken him out with a touch of his hand or finger didn't. He prevailed, in other words, because what? Grace again. And then as the sun is nearly dawning, and it is now, I think, starting to dawn on Jacob, that this man he's been wrestling with isn't somebody he actually had the power to be able to demand anything of. Then the man, the powerful one, raises his hand, and grace again, he blesses Jacob. Although really it's kind of a re-blessing, because God had blessed Jacob already, blessed him over and over and over again, even before Jacob had ever asked. Grace again. And with amazing grace now at last dawning on him, Jacob/Israel renames that place Peniel because he has realized. He names it Peniel because it means the face of God. For he says, "I've seen God's face and I lived." And dawn came. And Jacob, now Israel, walks back to his family, limping, of course, because I'm here to tell you his hip hurts. Later that morning in Genesis 33, he limped the final leg of the journey to meet his brother. Before him, to meet Esau first, he sent wave after wave of servants bearing gifts for his brother, gifts by which he presumably hoped to earn some mercy. In what is not his most courageous moment ever, he's not fully where he's supposed to be yet. He next sent his wives, starting, by the way, with his least favorite and then moving to his favorite. He sent them with his kids next, hoping presumably to soften Esau's heart in the direction of some mercy. And even though his hip was sore, he bowed 7 times when at last he came near Esau, hoping presumably to look like a man who deserved some mercy. At which time Esau, when he saw Jacob, raised his arms and he hugged him. He said, "What's with all the presents, bro? I have all I need just seeing you again." And Jacob/Israel was again blessed with a blessing he had not earned or deserved or bought or scrambled for. And it was the blessing, the gift, the grace of his brother's forgiveness and his brother's love. And Jacob/Israel, who had just been in that strange all-night wrestling match and eventually realizing that it was God he had been wrestling with and God he had seen face to face, now, just a few hours later, says to Esau, to see your face, to see your grace, is to see the face of God again. And that is the story. So, wrestling with God. Ever been there? Any of you may be there in any way right now? One of the grace things in this story is that God doesn't scold Jacob for his wrestling ways. Indeed, it is a grace thing that God comes to Jacob to wrestle with him, because here's something that's true. Dan Gable will back me up on this. You can't wrestle with someone without being close to them. Which means if you're wrestling with God, that might well speak not to the distance between the two of you. It might speak to the closeness between the two of you. Wrestling with God is actually a story that is oft repeated in the Bible's story of the people of God growing into their callings and their places in the purposes of God, including the greatest biblical wrestling match of all, which took place on that Thursday night, when a descendant of Abraham named Jesus, through whom God would reach with his greatest reach to love and have back his entire sin-broken world, Jesus wrestled so hard with the will of God that it drew blood. Luke says it caused him to sweat blood. Until what? Until those words that on one hand sound like words of surrender, which of course they are, except that in this case the surrender was not at all a sign of weakness. The surrender was a sign of strength, such strength of faith, as at last no longer wrestling with God, but resting in God, Jesus said, "Father, not my will, but yours be done." And then he got up to face not his brother Esau, hoping for mercy for his sin. He got up to face a cross, upon which he would be God's mercy for sinners. Wrestling with God, it's not a sin. Sometimes it's just part of the journey. But it's a wrestling match that's won neither by being pinned or by pinning. It's a wrestling match that is won by believing, which is to say by faith, which is to say by remembering that you are blessed already, for you are loved, and the one who loves you will see you through and will see you home. So get up, even if you're limping. Get up and go where God leads, and go where life leads. Go where love leads, and be in every single way you can the loving and merciful hands and feet and mouth and face of God in this wrestling with God world. Amen.